Hello and welcome to History of the Pacific Northwest. As always, I'm Ryan Tate and I am back now with another installment of our series on Lewis and Clark. So before we get started, just a few things. I want to say that I hope everyone who is listening that you enjoyed the interview I did with Mike Nolan. I enjoyed that a lot myself and I'm hoping to perhaps do some more interviews in the future. As always, I just want to say if anyone has questions about the podcast, please feel free to reach out to history.pnw.podcast@gmail.com. Again, that's history.pnw.podcast@gmail.com. You can email me with questions or comments. Let me know what you think about the shows. Let me know if you want to know more about something. And if I get any good questions, I promise that I will answer them on a future episode, because if you're thinking about it, perhaps others are as well. So please email me those and let me know what you think about the show. So I want to get back into Lewis and Clark. So last place we were was they had just finished the winter at the Mandan villages, which was particularly brutal and cold. But at the same time, they had great luck. They got along very well with the Mandan people. And now the snow and ice was beginning to thaw, and it was time for them to continue their journey up the Missouri. And so again, the lands that they were about to head into were complete terra incognita for that time period. They had no idea what was out there. They only had speculation. They had had a few conversations with some of the Mandan people about what to expect, and they told them that they were looking for the headwaters of the Missouri River and asked essentially what should they look for, where would it lead them to. They were told that it would lead them to a great fall. They would come to a waterfall at some point, and that would get them towards the headwaters of the Missouri. So they knew to be looking for that. Other than that, they had heard about the Rocky Mountains, which presented a major land barrier for them. And they'd also been warned about things like grizzly bears. But for the most part, they really didn't know what they were getting themselves into. And I ended last episode with a quote, but I would like to now read that quote in full because I think it very well sums up how much the party had changed since they originally set out from St. Louis. And I think it also shows a major reflection in Captain Lewis. So again, that quote he wrote in his journal on April 7th of 1805 upon getting ready to leave Fort Mandan. He said, quote, "Our vessels consisted of 6 small canoes and 2 large pirogues. This little fleet, although not quite so respectable as those of Columbus or Captain Cook, were still viewed by us with as much pleasure as those deservedly famed adventurers ever beheld theirs, and I dare say with quite as much anxiety for their safety and preservation. We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine, and these little vessels contained every article by which we were to expect to subsist or defend ourselves. However, as the state of mind in which we are generally gives the coloring to events when the imagination is suffered to wander into futurity, the picture which now presented itself to me was a most pleasing one. Entertaining as I do the most confident hope of succeeding in a voyage which had formed a darling project of mine for the last 10 years, I could but esteem this moment of my departure as among the happiest of my life." End quote. He would also say that, quote, "Every individual of the party are in good health and excellent spirits, zealously attached to the enterprise and anxious to proceed," unquote. And he would continue on to say about the men, quote, "Not a whisper of discontent or murmur is to be heard among them, but all in unison act with the most perfect harmony," unquote. So I think it is worth quoting all of that because this represents a lot. It represents Lewis's optimism. He is excited about this journey, and it really shows. I mean, it's obvious to say that this was something important to him, but I really believe that this quote shows just how important this entire endeavor was to Lewis. I think that this, and he says in the quote itself that this expedition was his dream. This is what he always wanted. This was the adventure he had been seeking for his entire life, back when he was a young boy on his family's plantation. He never wanted to be a business owner. He didn't want to run a plantation. That's why he joined the Army, and that's why he enjoyed military life, because it was what he truly wanted to do. And now he found himself here on way beyond the frontier of the United States, even though now technically in U.S. territory. And he was excited. He was thrilled at this project. It meant way more to him than I think he probably could have expressed in writing in this moment. And now he was off with his best friend and his colleague, Captain Clark, and the enlisted men who, this was a very different Corps of Discovery leaving Fort Mandan than had spent that terrible winter at Camp Dubois last year. And I believe I forgot to mention last week, but they had a number of discipline issues on their way up the Missouri River, getting to their location of where they put Fort Mandan. There were men who had broke into the whiskey and drank it. There was a man who fell asleep on duty. There was one man who deserted, Private Moses Reed, who would actually be sent home at this very same time. And they would not have discipline issues for the remainder of the expedition. They would not once again have to drop a court-martial. They wouldn't have to expressly discipline anyway in a way that would impugn their honor. Of course, there were issues in the day-to-day life of camp, and they were leaders and running this expedition and looking after these soldiers. But this crew that was leaving Fort Mandan, it was not the same crew. These were men who had spent a couple years now out in the frontier attached to this expedition. They were excited. They were thrilled as well. They were prepared. They had, I think, come to admire and respect the captains in an amazing way. And I don't think that they would question their leadership for the remainder of the expedition, at least in no way that is present in any documentation we have. And so Lewis did two things before leaving Fort Mandan. First, he loaded the keelboat, the big one, with all the articles that they had discovered coming up the Missouri, the groundhog that they had captured along with some other live animals and specimens, all the plants, copies of the journals, maps, everything that they had collected and created along the way. They were now going to send back down to St. Louis, at which point it would go to New Orleans, and then it would be shipped around Florida, and it would go to Washington, D.C., directly to Jefferson's house, and that would be the first and only reliable news that Thomas Jefferson would get of the expedition. So that was the first order of business. And now they were also departing with some additional members. As I said, they were now going to be joined by Sacagawea and her new baby, little Jean-Baptiste, who Clark and many of the other men would refer to as Pomp or Pompey. And they would be joined by Sacagawea's husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. Now, again, Charbonneau was a French-Canadian fur trapper, and Sacagawea was his Shoshone wife, who he had either bought or won gambling. And again, I can't stand Toussaint Charbonneau. I have very little good things to say about him. And Sacagawea was, again, she just fascinates me to a degree that I can hardly explain, because it's like we have this snapshot of her life, and even within that snapshot, we know so little about her. There is mountains of speculation about her life, both before, during, and after the expedition, because unfortunately Lewis and Clark don't mention her as much as we would like to, which is kind of incredible. And I don't really know what that says about them personally, because as we go on, we'll see just how important Sacagawea was to the expedition and to the success of the expedition. And they had this opportunity to learn so much about her culture, so much about her people, so much about what was beyond the Rockies, even though she was a young girl when she was taken from her Shoshone village. And either they didn't ask those questions or they just never found it relevant to write down the answers to them. Either way is bonkers. Either they did speak with Sacagawea, who Clark referred to as Janie. That was his nickname for her. And so Clark obviously was close enough that he had a nickname for her. And either they asked her all these things, they learned a bunch about her, or they didn't write it down, or they never asked these things. And I don't know. I apologize. I got on a tangent there for a second, but it's from a historian standpoint, it's such a frustrating thing because I want to know everything about her. I want to know way more about her than I do. But in any case, so Sacagawea and her young child, her young boy, they changed and did more for this expedition than I think anyone possibly could have realized at the time. There's a couple instances where she actually did something tangible and amazing just by, her actions and her presence. And there's also there's the intangible aspect of her. I think you got to remember every night, all these men, they're going to get together, they're camping, they're going to be around a fire, they're going to be cooking. Pierre Cruzat, who was one of the privates on the expedition, he was the lead boatman, and he was a wonderful fiddler. So often at night he would break out the fiddle and he'd play the fiddle for the men. They dance and sing. And this whole time they've got this little baby with them who would eventually grow to be this little toddler. And I think it kind of created a new energy for the expedition to have this, for all the men to just watch this little boy slowly grow bigger and bigger. I'm sure a lot of them kind of saw him as an unofficial mascot of the expedition in some ways. So they leave Fort Mandan and they first find themselves moving through the Great Plains. Again, they're in the Dakota area, and they're going to be making their way west now towards the Rockies. And while in the Great Plains, they see all sorts of animals they never seen. They see the gray wolf, which Lewis was absolutely astounded by. He got to witness the gray wolves hunt down buffaloes in packs and work together to surround their prey and pick it off a little bit at a time until all of them could come in and take the whole thing down. And so he found that very fascinating. He almost believed that somehow they could communicate telekinetically. He just was so amazed at the way they worked together in unison and, as animals too. So they saw many of the gray wolves. And Lewis also noted the abundance of beaver in this area. And now, again, if you remember back to my episodes on the fur trade, beaver would be it would become the replacement for sea otter. So sea otter fur was that was the ultimate fur that you could get. Beaver was a close second. And even during this time, beaver trapping was a very lucrative business, and beaver would fetch a high price. They had this excellent fur that was water resistant, especially when it was treated properly. Most of the top hats you see during this time period, they were made with beaver pelt. So Lewis noted the abundance of beaver in the plains. And then on April 29th, they found their first grizzly bear, which the grizzly bear would become a major nuisance for the party during their time. And this first one, they decided that they would go ahead and shoot it because they believed that the reason the Native Americans had so much trouble with grizzly bears was because they had bows and arrows and inferior rifles. And so Lewis and the party believed that they had these, nice Kentucky long rifles. It was sort of top of the line military equipment at the time. They figured they'd have no problem bringing down a grizzly bear. So April 29th, they find their first. They had to shoot it 10 times before the bear would go down. They fired a first few rounds of shots at it, hit it a few times, and the bear immediately charged them. And it took 10 shots in total before they could bring the bear down. The best part was the bear that they found was an adolescent. It was not even a full-grown grizzly bear. And this would be indicative of the rest of their encounters with grizzly bears throughout the rest of the expedition. It is actually amazing that no one died or got injured with the amount of encounters with grizzly bears, the amount of times they tried to shoot them. And some grizzly bears that they took down were able to take anywhere up to, I think, 14 or 15 shots before they would actually go down. And this was after the bears getting punctured lungs, shot in the heart. It didn't matter. And so the reason for this is these grizzlies, so as opposed to the black bears that the Corps of Discovery was used to seeing way back east, grizzly bears are much different. They are bigger. They are thicker. They have thicker fur, thicker skin, thicker layers of fat, more muscle. They are much angrier. Grizzly bears will fight and they get hyper fixated on the things they're chasing and their prey. Black bears, now don't get me wrong, black bears can be dangerous, but they tend to run away and they tend to not put up as much of a fight. Whereas grizzly bears, once they've decided they want to kill something, they are going to kill it. And so they really suffered with this. And the grizzly bears, again, would be a major nuisance for them. And even a few times Lewis remarks in his journal that at night they would be in camp and, in their tents, and they could hear grizzlies around. They could hear them around the camp circling. They could hear them roaring. A few times seamen actually managed to scare grizzly bears away from the camp just by barking. And so seamen probably protected them many times. So, again, as I said, this is just one instance where Charbonneau made a major mistake. While they were going up the Missouri, there was a few times where they were in rough waters, and for some reason, they decided Charbonneau would be at the helm. And one time, he almost tipped over a pirogue because he couldn't steer it into the wind. He actually turned it broadside and away from the wind and almost tipped over the whole thing. And that was the best case scenario. He would do much worse later. So they continued their way up the Missouri. Again, their goal was, they had two goals. They needed to get to the headwaters of the Missouri, but that goal was part of their really overarching primary goal, and that was they were trying to find the shortest all-water route to the Pacific. And again, this goes back to the talk of the Northwest Passage. This was a time where many were still hoping that the Northwest Passage was there, and Jefferson especially knew that if this Corps could discover the Northwest Passage, it would be a huge boon for the United States. They would be able to simply navigate the waterway, across the Missouri, linked to whatever river, which they assumed would be the Columbia River, and then make their way out into the Pacific Ocean. And that would completely open up trade to the Far East, which they couldn't realistically get to quickly at the moment. So they were following the Missouri because they'd hoped to do that. And while they were doing that, unfortunately, they missed Bozeman Pass, which would have saved them months on their journey. But again, they weren't just looking to get to the Pacific as fast as possible. They were looking to find an all-water route to the Pacific. So that could have been why they missed that easy shot across the Rocky Mountains. So again, while they were on the water, this time the weather was getting really bad. And for some reason, both the captains were on shore, which was very rare. They had kind of made it a rule that at least one of them would be with the boats at all times, and only one of them would ever be on shore. But for whatever reason, during this particular instance, both captains were on shore. And again, Charbonneau was at the helm of one of the pirogues, and the wind started whipping up, and the canoe started to waver back and forth. Well, Charbonneau, instead of doing what most normal people would do and steer the boat and, fix the course, he completely let go of the rudder, and he began to cry and pray for God to save him, and would not listen to anyone, and he would not stop what he was doing. Lewis was terrified and actually started firing his gun into the air to try to get the attention of either Charbonneau or anyone on the boat before the pirogue completely overturned. And to no avail, Charbonneau would not do what needed to be done. And eventually Pierre Cruzat, who I don't know why he wasn't steering the boat because he was the better boatman, started poking Charbonneau with his gun and told him either, take up the rudder, steer the boat, or I will shoot you right now. Charbonneau finally came to his senses, probably having a gun in his face. But this was after a lot of water had dipped into the pirogue and a lot of articles were washed overboard. And Lewis, who was terrified, he could not believe it. He was very worried that, maybe the journals could be getting lost, the maps, specimens he'd collected, etc. And that was his greatest of fears, where Lewis actually, he threw off his overcoat and he was getting ready to swim into the river to start rescuing the stuff. But he decided not to, because I think he even says in his journal, he took a second and kind of realized, what am I doing? This would be a terrible idea. All that's going to happen is I'm going to drown, because the water was rough. Now, it was during this moment that Sacagawea actually jumped into the river, and she began to save as much as she could of what spilled overboard. It was truly a selfless moment for her. And again, if the captains thanked her or expressed gratitude to her, we don't know, because I don't believe they wrote anything in their journals about it. But in any case, Sacagawea was likely very instrumental in preserving some very important documents. And again, we get this insight into just how important this expedition is for Lewis. Now, remember, they're not just trying to take boats and walk from where they were to the Pacific just to do it, just to say we did it. Like, this is a very important expedition with, scientific discovery at hand. This has to do with, claims to the Louisiana Territory and later the Pacific Northwest, which is where they're headed into. This goes way beyond merely getting to a destination and returning home. And we see in this moment where Lewis was prepared to swim into a dangerous and choppy river to retrieve these items, just how important this expedition was to him. He was ready to risk his life. Thankfully, he thought better after a few seconds. And who knows, maybe even Clark pointed it out to him that, hey, don't jump in the river. That's not a good idea. So in any case, they continue up the Missouri and they begin getting closer and closer. And in June, they reach a fork in the river. And now they don't know what to do. So they had spoken to the Mandans and the Hidatsa people about, what they would see. And they told them, you're going to come to the Great Falls. And they didn't ever mention, they said they said 5 Great Falls, but they did not ever mention a fork in the river. And at least this is according to the captains. They may have mentioned a fork, and maybe it got lost in translation, or perhaps the natives didn't. Perhaps they didn't see a need to mention a fork because maybe they thought that it seemed very clear, which way to go. So maybe to them it was like it's not even worth mentioning because there's only one correct way to go. Now, this was an important moment. It's June. They're getting into summer. And I think Lewis, in his mind, he was hoping. So two things. One, I think this was very overzealous. Lewis and Clark wanted to get to the Pacific, and they wanted to get all the way back to the Mandan villages for next winter. But I think that was a lofty goal, and I don't know if that probably just spoke to them not being so certain of how far they had to go. Perhaps they didn't realize that, or maybe they just believed they could do it. I'm not sure. But in any case, remember, time is sort of always against them. They're surviving. They have to make sure they've got enough rations and goods to keep them alive and thriving in this wilderness. And now here they are at a fork in the river. There's two directions to go. And if they go down the wrong one, it could mean the end of the expedition. If they go down the wrong fork and it takes them, in the wrong direction, it takes them so far from their destination that they're unable to go back. Well, you're talking about a loss in morale. You're talking about a loss in time. You're talking about they might not be able to get to the Pacific in a good enough amount of time. So, like I said, it sounds simple, but it's not. So, what they decide, they talk it over. So, Lewis and Clark talk about there's two forks. There's a South Fork and a North Fork. And either one of them could be the Missouri. So, the South Fork was much more clear and is swifter. And then the North Fork was a little more muddy and it was not moving as fast. Now, a lot of people thought the North Fork must be the true Missouri because it looks like the Missouri, right? The nickname for the Missouri is the Big Muddy, I believe. And so they see this, kind of murky, slow-moving river, and they think, well, that's got to be the Missouri. But Lewis, who believes, no, based on geography, we want the river that is coming from the mountains, the one that's closest to the mountains, that's got to be the Clear Fork. And so they discuss it for a bit, and then they decide, okay, we're going to send short parties up both forks, and then we'll come back, and we'll talk about what we find. So that's what they do. They spend a few days going up separate forks of the river, and then they come back to discuss what they found. And Lewis and Clark both agree that the South Fork is the true Missouri. But they talk to the enlisted men, and literally every single one of them, including Pierre Cruzat, who is a very experienced boatman, he thinks they should go north. All the enlisted men think, no, captains, the North Fork, that's the way we got to go. But the captains are certain. They believe the South Fork is the correct direction. And again, I think this really demonstrates how committed the enlisted men were to the captains, because the captains, in probably as nice a way as they could have said, hey, we hear you guys. You're all saying North Fork. We think you're wrong. We're in charge. We're going down the South Fork. Okay? And that night, Cruzat got out his fiddle. The men danced to the fiddle music. They danced around the fire. They had fun. They, had their ration of whiskey for the day, celebrated, and basically committed and said, all right, captains, we will follow you wherever you tell us to go. And thankfully, the captains were right. They picked the correct fork, and 10 days later, June 13th, 1805, they reached the Great Falls of the Missouri. Lewis was absolutely astounded, and he attempted to describe the Great Falls in his journal, And multiple times he scratched out what he had wrote, and he tried to say something different, and he would get frustrated with that, and he'd scratch that out and write something else. And eventually he just gave up and said he could not describe the beauty and the wonder at looking at these great falls. Okay, so now they had to get above the falls, and this meant portaging the canoes and the pirogues. So now they had to, what they did was they essentially built these massive rollers. They would fell trees and, trim the sides of them, create these massive rollers, and then pull the boats and pirogues, everything up the hills around the falls. And this was an intense endeavor. The men were absolutely working their butts off all day long, dragging these boats up and around the falls, portaging, finding the best path. And look, there isn't much in the way of trails here. They're not working with, short spaces or anything. So they set to this grueling task of portaging up and around the falls. And during that time, Sacagawea gets very sick, and Lewis attempts to treat her. And it's not certain exactly what is going on with her. She's got a fever. She's having trouble keeping any food down. And Lewis is doing, all the normal stuff. He's bleeding her. He's giving her Russia's pills, doing all he can to try to figure it out. And eventually he gets her water from a sulfur spring nearby, and that helps her to begin alleviating the pain. Lewis was extremely attentive during this time when she was sick because, well, the most obvious reason is because of how important she was. Again, Lewis knew that they had to make contact with the Shoshone people because they needed horses. Once they had gotten above the falls, they would need to get horses so that they could make their way through the Rockies and carry their baggage and whatnot. They still were going to bring boats. That wasn't necessarily going away, but Lewis knew that if they had any hope of survival and any hope of making it to the Pacific, they were going to need horses, and the Shoshone people were their best bet to trade and negotiate for horses. And Sacagawea, being a Shoshone girl, could help them translate and could help them find the Shoshone people. And also probably it would be very helpful for them to have a Shoshone person with them when they meet. So Lewis is able to heal Sacagawea after giving tons of attention to her. And they begin their portage around the falls. During this time, there's this curious moment, and I've looked it up, and it still happens to this day, but the enlisted men consistently heard what sounded like a cannon going off in the distance at irregular intervals. They estimated it was a 6-pound cannon going off about 2 or 3 miles distant. But of course there was no cannons going off. And I've looked it up, and it sounds like this is a phenomenon known as a skyquake. And it can still be common. It is still commonly heard in that area. So actually, if anyone has ever heard a skyquake or that weird, and it wasn't, let me specify, it wasn't thunder and lightning. It was a clear, cloudless day. There was no lightning, no nothing. And like I said, it's a curious phenomenon. So if anyone knows more about skyquakes, if anyone's ever heard one or has been around them in that region of, far eastern Idaho, western Montana, I would love to hear about it. So let me know about that. I would find that interesting if someone were to email in and tell me about it. So Lewis asks Sacagawea, or Lewis or Clark, I can't remember who did it, but they asked Sacagawea if her people had a name for white man. And this was probably a lost in translation moment, because the truth was, first off, no, her people didn't have a word for white men because they'd never seen white men before. And so Sacagawea said Tababon was their word. And Tababone probably translates better to like foreigner or stranger. And so it wasn't exactly what they were looking for. But Lewis decided as they were getting close to the top of the falls that they needed to find the Shoshone people. They needed to make contact. So Clark tried to go out on a small scouting party first and was unsuccessful. And then Lewis would try next and he would go on as well. Now, strangely enough, neither of the captains brought Sacagawea with them when they went out to look for the Shoshones, which I find to be a very strange move. And there's been a lot of speculation. Some say it was their misogyny, which is possible. Maybe they believed that they can move faster if they didn't bring Sacagawea and her small baby. Maybe they didn't want to bring Charbonneau as well, because obviously Charbonneau was going to come along if Sacagawea was going to come along, and maybe they just couldn't stand the thought of just having to spend any more time with the insufferable French trapper than they already had to. But curiously, neither of them did it, which is odd because, like I said, these are two very intelligent men who were trying to contact the Shoshone people. You would think having a Shoshone girl with them would be very helpful. But in any case, they go out looking. So Lewis brings a small party consisting, of course, of his favorite George Drouillard, who was the premier woodsman, the best hunter in the party, someone who, anytime Lewis had to go out on his own for anything, he often brought Drouillard with him. So on August 11th, as they're looking, Lewis spots a young Shoshone boy who he estimated was about, I think, between 250 and 300 yards away, if I remember correctly. And the boy was on horseback that far away and noticed them. And Lewis did what he often did with other natives back east, is he would take a blanket and he would spread it out on the ground, and that was a sign of coming to speak peaceably. And then he held out an American flag in front of him and began walking towards the boy, and the whole time he's shouting "Tababone, Tababone," because he's hoping to tell the boy that he's a white man, but he's probably just shouting stranger at him, which is kind of humorous in a sort of way. Anyways, Lewis begins slowly moving towards him, and then he notices that Privates Hugh McNeil and George Drouillard and one other who, I'm sorry, the name is escaping me at the moment, they're moving towards this young boy from a different direction, and Lewis realizes suddenly that the young man on horseback is kind of looking back and forth between Lewis and between these others who are these others who are marching towards him. And now he's starting to get a little freaked out, because it turns out that this actually was a young boy, probably in his early teens. I think maybe 14 or 15 years old. And he sees these few strangers who, now again, they no longer look like Americans back east. At this point, they've abandoned whatever clothes that they set out with. Like, all of the party, they're wearing moccasins and elk skins. They probably look more like other Native Americans than they do like white men. Their skin is dark because of the sun, and they're all tan. Yeah, they're covered in these elkskin, dress robes. As far as this Shoshone boy knows, these are just Blackfeet warriors who have caught him off guard, and they're slowly moving towards him. So Lewis notices the other men moving towards the Shoshone boy, and he tries to signal to them, stop moving. And they miss the Drouillard notices, and he stops moving, but the others don't. And when they were about 150 yards away from the boy, he turned his horse and fled. Lewis was irritated, and he was downcast, and he was actually very ticked off. He gave it to his soldiers, and probably one of the few times where Lewis admits to losing his temper in a big way. But he had felt like this is their hope for, horses. This is the hope for the future of the expedition, and their hope just ran away from them. So they continued to move on. They were hoping if they followed the trail, they would eventually come in contact with the boys' tribe. The following day, on August 12th, they reached the headwaters of the Missouri, and Hugh McNeil stands on both sides. He puts one foot on each side of the Missouri River. And Lewis wrote that he, quote, thanked his God that he had lived to bestride the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri, unquote. And so they had done it. They'd found the headwaters of the Missouri. But this was sort of a bittersweet moment for Lewis because, yes, they had fulfilled their goal of finding the headwaters, but it became very apparent at this moment that there was no all-water route to the Pacific. And Lewis would eventually have to return to Jefferson and tell him that this dream of the Northwest Passage was finally done. And there really was no all-water route to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. But that was thoughts for another day, while Lewis was probably somewhat discouraged or bummed out, if you will, about not being able to find the Northwest Passage. He joins a long list of others who had looked for it and failed. But they had other things to worry about at the moment. So eventually they did encounter the Shoshone. Lewis ran into an older woman and a few small children who, at first, they attempted to run and hide, but there was nowhere to go. And they all sort of resigned themselves to being captured. The woman, she had knelt down and hung her head, basically saying, whatever happens, happens. And Lewis went over to her and helped her up. He rolled up his sleeve to show his white skin, because, again, they were so tan at the time that he looked very dark. And so he rolled his sleeve up to show her that he had white skin underneath it and said, again, tababon, which, like we know now, does not mean what he thought it meant. But he was trying to say, I'm a white man, I'm different. And he signaled his friendship to her. He gave her some things, and he had learned from Sacagawea that the Shoshone paint each other's faces with a vermilion grease paint type of stuff, and that's how they show signs of friendship to one another. So Lewis did that to this woman and tried to signal to her to, hey, like call out the others you were with, like, we're here as friends. We just want to meet you, and we want to meet your tribe. And so she did as was asked, and she began to lead this small group of men with Lewis to their main encampment. And when she did, they were greeted by warriors riding out at them, because, again, they had been tipped off by the young boy from the other day. They believed that raiders were coming to their encampment. They believed, potentially the Blackfeet or maybe the Hidatsa, someone else. And instead they find this small group of white men who they had never seen before. And again, Lewis, explains the same thing, says he's friendly. He tries to spread the blanket out on the ground and show them, like, hey, I'm here to treat, convinces them to talk with him. And before they talk, the Shoshone have this thing they do. They remove their moccasins before they have any sort of peace talk. And Lewis said it was a sign of them saying if they lie, during this time, if they're dishonest or they don't follow through on something they promise, they should go barefoot the rest of their lives. And so Lewis followed suit, and he removed his moccasins as well, and they sat down. He discovered that their chief's name, and again, I'm just going to remind you that term chief, it's not exactly what we think it means. This is more of a way for Lewis personally to say like, okay, this is the person who I'm saying is in charge. But the chief's name is Kamiowait, and he tells them about, hey, again, tells them as best he can, because remember, they share no common language. The Shoshone, they don't know French, so they can't talk to, Drew Yar or anyone else. There's absolutely no way that they can communicate, so they use sign language. Lewis does his best to, he draws things in the dirt and with his hands tries to explain as best he can what's going on, and the Shoshone do the same thing. They're trying their best to understand one another. And so Lewis, through signs, and again, just imagine how imperfect that has to be. Like, I don't imagine someone with not only zero of the same language as you, but also like zero of the same, cultural world understanding as you. It's very different. And so Lewis does his best to explain that he is, the leader of a small party, and they're currently coming up the Missouri. They're coming to find them where they're at right now. And they are kind of the first envoys of a new nation who's going to come. They want to trade. They want to bring prosperity to the Shoshone, and they want to eventually bring them guns and other things. And, this is difficult for the Shoshone people. So first off, there are some people, some of the warriors are telling Kamiowait, like, hey, I think this guy he's trying to trap us. Like, he's going to lead us to his people, and they're going to overrun us. They're going to take everything we have. Like, we are already struggling as it is. We can't trust these strangers. And then some are also hearing Lewis, signify that, hey, like, if you help us now, you're going to be friends of this powerful country, and eventually traders are going to come up here and you're going to get guns, because now the Shoshones did have some guns, but the Shoshones often found themselves outgunned by a lot of their rivals, such as the Hidatsa, the Nez Perce, and the Blackfeet, who had very common run-ins with white traders, and they were able to procure for themselves better weaponry. So the Shoshone are consistently outgunned. They can't go hunt the buffalo when they want to, because if they do, they'll often find themselves fighting enemies. And so when they're hearing Lewis tell them, if you help us now, it's going to mean good things for you later, that's a pretty tempting offer. And they're like, oh, we'd really like to we'd really like to get those guns and stuff that you're talking about. So for the time being, they decide to follow Lewis, and Lewis is going to lead them back towards where he's hoping Clark is going to be coming up the river with the rest of the Corps of Discovery. So Lewis is leading them there, and he'd left a note for Clark telling them, what the situation was, and hopefully that they would stop there and be prepared to meet Lewis. So Lewis is leading Kamiowait and his warriors down to the river. And again, they're very concerned. They don't trust Lewis, many of them. And actually, some of them would prefer to just kill Lewis and then find the rest of his party, kill them too, take all their weapons. Like, you have to think that is a very tempting situation to be in. They definitely are outnumbering the group that Lewis has, and they could easily overwhelm them with numbers alone. And so Lewis is dealing with this distrust, and he can kind of feel it. He's trying to do everything he can to convince Kamiowait and convince the Shoshone people that he does want to be friendly with them. He has nothing but friendly intentions. And so as they're making their way to meet where Clark is, they start getting closer, and Kamiowait actually wants him and Lewis to trade clothing. And so Lewis takes off his hat and puts it on Kamiowait, and they start, trading articles of clothing, because Kamiowait wants Lewis to look like a Shoshone, and his men with him to look like Shoshone people, just in case they are being led into an ambush. They're going to be the ones who get hit. And Lewis even goes so far as to, he takes his rifle and he gives it to Cameahwait and, signals to him, hey, if I'm lying to you, if I lead you into a trap, you shoot me with that gun. And so Lewis is making this, huge show of trying to tell the Shoshone, like, please trust me. I really am friendly. And if I'm lying, you can kill me. And then after all this, pomp and circumstance, to Lewis's horror, when they get to the river, he sees the note he left for Clark intact, and Clark is still not there yet. So now the Shoshone's doubts jump up again, and they're very concerned about Lewis. But Lewis runs down and he gets the note, and of course, the Shoshone people can't read. So Lewis makes this big show about, showing them the note, and he decides to lie to them. And this is, of course, after all his talk of, saying how honest he is and white people don't lie. They don't go back on their word, etc. And I mean, you can make of that what you want. I can't fault Lewis in this moment for lying, because I think he did exactly what he had to do, both to not get killed and to make sure that the party is successful, the expedition is successful. So Lewis takes this note and he makes this big display of reading it, and he lies and says that the note is actually from Clark, and it's in advance saying that, they're going to be here soon. And so that's what he does, and it ends up convincing the Shoshone warriors and Cameahwait that that's what the note says. But to Lewis's luck, eventually Clark and the rest of the party does come to the point, and they all meet together with the Shoshone. And now, of course, Cameahwait and his warriors are very happy that indeed these white men, these travelers, actually are friendly. Lewis was telling the truth. He's being honest. So now they get together and they're going to have this big council. Sacagawea is absolutely thrilled. She's actually recognized by another person in the tribe. It was a woman actually who was present on the day that Sacagawea was taken by the Hidatsa raiders. When Sacagawea was taken, this other girl, whose name I'm not sure of, to be honest, at the moment, she recognized her immediately and told her that, she had jumped the stream and she had hidden somewhere and she wasn't found by the Hidatsa, but sadly Sacagawea was. And so Sacagawea is reunited with her people and even familiar faces, which I can't imagine the excitement and thrill that she must have felt in this moment. And then as they are sitting down with the Shoshone, they're, talking about why they're there, what's going on. Lewis and Clark can finally, discuss with Cameahwait what's happening and talk about how they need horses and how if they help them now, their people are going to be helped by white traders coming in later years. It's going to be a huge boon to their tribe and their civilization. And how they do this, of course, is it's translated from Lewis and Clark, and then it's translated into French, and then from French to Hidatsa, and then from Hidatsa to Shoshone, where Sacagawea at the very end of that tells her people what is being said. So this meeting is taking a very long time. And during this time, as Sacagawea is translating and going through everything, she continues to stare at the chief Cameahwait, and then eventually it hits her, and she stands up during this council meeting that they're all having. She stands up, she takes a blanket, and she wraps it around Cameahwait, and she exclaims to him that he is in fact her brother. This is one of those moments in history where I'm like, you just can't make this stuff up. Sacagawea, who was taken from her people as a little girl, captured by Hidatsa raiders, brought halfway across the continental United States, only to be linked up with a group on an expedition to discover the quickest all-water route to the Pacific. And she winds up back with her exact band of Shoshone people. And not only that, but her very own brother is the chief of that Shoshone band. The chief of the group that the Corps of Discovery absolutely needed to meet to procure horses, to hire guides, to make their way over the Rocky Mountains and to get to the Pacific safely. If not for Sacagawea joining them, and if not for running into this exact band of Shoshone, I don't know if they would have succeeded. It is truly one of those moments where it is almost impossible that it could have happened, and yet it happened. And so here they are with the Shoshone. They are preparing to procure horses and find a way to get to the Rocky Mountains, find their way across the Continental Divide, and make their way to the Pacific. And they just so happen to have brought along the sister of Kamehameha, the chief of that Shoshone band. It's tough to say the emotional feel that Sacagawea must have had. They mentioned that they actually had to postpone the council because Sacagawea couldn't contain herself. She was so full of tears, and I think she was excited and probably distraught in some way. I'm sure she was just experiencing all these emotions that I can't even imagine personally. And so, not to belabor the point, but this is literally a girl who she was stolen from her home and raped by probably her Hidatsa captor, and then by Toussaint Charbonneau, forced to be his husband. And now here she is with her people, and she is reunited with her very own brother. It's just, it's poetic, to be honest. So that's where I will leave it today. The Corps of Discovery has made their way to the Continental Divide. They've met with exactly who they were looking for. They found the Shoshone people. They're feeling good and achieved. They've gotten this next step out of the way. Now they need to get their horses. They need to find a way across the Continental Divide, find the Columbia River, and then they need to make their way down to the Pacific. And again, I cannot express how lucky they got in this moment. So next time we will continue on with Lewis and Clark as they do exactly what I just said. Again, thank you so much for listening. If you want to support the show, go into the show notes. You can find a link to do that. If you have any questions or comments, please email me. Again, that email was history.pnw.podcast@gmail.com. Check out our Instagram page and stay tuned for the next episode. As always, thank you so much for listening, and take care.